Good evening, and welcome to the midweek service of Calvary Baptist Church. Glad to have you with us on our live stream, and glad for those that are in the auditorium here this evening. We've been on Wednesday night studying through the book of James, and James has a repeated focus on our reaction to lowliness, adversity, poverty, versus our desire for to be on the high point, to be well-to-do, to be rich, or to be healthy. And so James is dealing with these categories of how to think and the importance of thinking very, very critically about what he would call the high position and the low position. In fact, to be very careful that we not make a false judgment and think that a low position means that we or someone else is somehow to be pitied or to be coddled or to be angry at, or to think the person in high position is somehow automatically privileged or in some great favor. James wants us to think in other categories than just external or even physical kind of distresses. That's true with ourselves. It's also true when our thoughts about others. When James turns the chapter from chapter 1 to chapter 2, he turns the focus away from just thinking about our own condition of perhaps of adversity to think about how we treat other people that are in adversity. Now, we've always kind of suspected that he was thinking this way, that it's not just ourselves, but also how we treat others. That was very much part of his concern. At the beginning of chapter 2, he directly addresses the issue of showing favoritism towards the rich and against the poor. That is, thinking that somehow the rich are the ones that we should favor and praise and want to be friends with, and thinking the poor are to be neglected or to be despised. Perhaps they are not worthy of as much attention. So James calls us to not show favoritism towards the rich and against the poor. But not only does James make the case that we should not show favoritism, he particularly does so in relationship to God. He challenges that favoritism in theological terms, not just in terms of books and theological statements, but theology meaning God-centeredness, theology, the thoughts of God, the logic of God. And James doesn't just rebuke favoritism from a practical point of view, which we may think important to do, that it's just not very nice to show favoritism. But James emphasizes the Godward perspective on it. So when he rebukes favoritism, he does so on the frame of thinking that it dishonors the people that God favors, that God shows great favor towards the poor. Now, the good news is that God does show grace and favor towards the rich as well. But if you look at biblical history, perhaps if you look at the early history of Christianity, in fact, maybe for most of Christianity's history, many Christians, in fact, the majority of Christians, were not well-to-do, were on the poorer classes. And it was pretty clear that God shows favors towards the poor, so favoritism against them goes against those whom God has honored. The second thing that he points out is that it just doesn't make any sense from a practical perspective to favor the rich, because, at least in James's experience in the churches that he was writing to, the rich were persecuting the Christians, were persecuting the poor. And so to favor the rich didn't make any internal sense. And so it really dishonored Christian experience. And then he says that these rich were actually blaspheming God's name, that Christians were bearing God's name. So you see this God-centeredness to his rebuke of favoritism, that we ought to reject favoritism because of God, because God has a particular stance in this matter. And just thinking back to chapter 1, where James had told us that we should count it all joy when we encounter various trials, when we are the poor, or we are in a lowly state, because God uses those situations to show grace and mercy. So having looked at the first 7 verses, I'd like to look now at really the last point that James makes as to why we should reject favoritism. And the last one concerns the law. And so if we pick up in verse number 8, we read, "If you really fulfill the royal law, according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." That is, if you fulfill the Bible, the Scriptures, which has this command in Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. So do this law and you are not sinning, you are living in God's favor. Verse 9, "But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, 'Do not commit adultery,' also said, 'Do not commit murder.' Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So, speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment." So this section, a little longer, but really one basic point, is that if we show partiality, we break the law. I say one point, but this point has, James fills out with some richness, some depth to this teaching about the law in terms of it standing against favoritism. And he phrases it in terms of not just law, but he calls it a royal law. Literally, the Greek word royal, translated royal there, means that which concerns the king, that which concerns a king. So this law is that which concerns the king. We might wonder what's the significance of that. In some sense, all law is kingly. Why does James particularly bring up that point about the royal law or that which concerns the king here? My suspicion is that it's related to what we already noticed in the first 7 verses, is that James is particularly pressing this point to be about God. How you treat the poor is directly related to how you think about God the king. So he's stressing that this law is an expression of the king's will, the king's edict, that is particularly interested in the poor of his kingdom, in the lowly of his kingdom. And so he's drawing attention to perhaps the personal nature behind the king, the law, that there is a king behind the laws that we are called to obey. Well, think with me about this challenge to keep the law. He says, if you love your neighbor, you are keeping the law. What can we learn, or what do we learn about this call to keep the royal law? In some sense, he's drawing attention to the whole law here. Later, he's going to talk about all of the law. But this particular emphasis on love is as an expression of the royalness of God's will. Emphasizes love as perhaps the sum of the law, or the greatest of the laws, or the central law, that which binds all the other things together. This particular command of God to love your neighbor as yourself strikes not just as one particular law among many, but a central law that binds a lot of laws together, so that many people have correctly noted that you could really reduce the 10 commandments to 2 commandments, to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus himself points out that truth, that there is a sense that these 2 laws, and that really can be reduced to one, to love, are not just individual laws, but they're a sum of all the law. So it's particularly important in James' mind to teach his congregation that loving one's neighbor is no trifle matter. It's not just a minor point among others that you might dismiss, but rather it's an abiding, it's a glue that holds a lot of the laws together. So Paul, the Apostle Paul in Romans 13, says that if we love, we have kept all these others, because love does no harm. Love, it seeks to be fair to one's neighbor, to not be envious of his possessions, not take his wife, not take his goods, not lie against him, not slander him, and all these other commands. So love is a summation of the law. So James is calling the congregation to see this matter of partiality as important as an expression of all that the law really is. As we think about the idea of the royalness of the law, or the kingliness of the law, we can't help but see the Gospel's emphasis upon our King, the King of the Jews, being most exemplified of that of love. That his example, his emphasis of his life was deeply rooted in being loving. That his attitudes towards the poor was one of great compassion and grace, and of course to any of the rich that were humble enough to receive it, he was very gracious to them as well. Now there were, of course, opponents who had no interest in his grace, one way or the other, that he was in sharp relationship with, but Jesus' presentation of the Gospels is one of considerable compassion and considerable acts of love. The greatest moment of his life, that of being sacrificed for the sins of the world, the greatest expression of love in world history. Greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. Jesus not only laid down his life for his friends, but even for his enemies. And so love was the example of Jesus, who was the king, who showed great love and compassion in his ministry, even dying for the cause of love. And so love is an evidence of one's faithfulness to this king. Jesus' teaching, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount recorded in Matthew 5 through 7, there's a couple of common themes in that, but love is certainly one of the binding themes in the Sermon on the Mount, to be loving, to be compassionate. And if you take Jesus' teaching in other passages in the Gospels, you see love is a clear expectation of his followers. And so when Jesus was essentially giving his last greetings or last exhortations to his disciples in John 13 through 17, he emphasized that people will know his followers by their love. They have a new commandment, and they are to be characterized by love. And so James is deeply steeped not only in Old Testament law, which he is, but he's also very well versed in Jesus' commands. And he knows that Jesus was expecting his followers to be loving. So there's that really ironic moment in the Gospels where James and John, the sons of thunder, are showing their thunderous quality. People had been obstinate and mistreated them, and James or John or both of them together, say, "Shall we call fire down from heaven on them?" And Jesus says, "You do not know what spirit you are of. Now, you don't understand the nature that my followers are going to be characterized not by this thunderbolts of judgment, but by the evidence of love in their life." So James says this idea of partiality is to be overcome with a commitment to the sum of the law, to the example of Jesus the King, and to the expectation his followers are going to be marked by love towards others. Now, of course, you can love the rich in a certain sense, but it's always hard to know when somebody loves the rich. It's one of the tricky parts of having money is to know why people love you. Just because you have a lot of friends doesn't necessarily mean they love you. It's easier to tell the friends of the poor are loving because the poor have nothing to give them. So in that sense, the poor are a great test of love. They're a great evidence of love because there's not a lot of reason to help them, not a lot of reason to favor them other than because you love them. And so that's a great test. And James is concerned that his churches, his believers, would not show favoritism against the poor, but rather favor the poor because it's the law of the king. So he talks about, all right, if you don't do this, if you show partiality, you're not just showing partiality. You are breaking the king's law. So notice with me as he develops this, and it's the main part of his treatment on this issue, in verses 9 on down through the end of this section of verse 13. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So he really wants to hit this home hard, is he wants to emphasize, and you can kind of see, we've already been hinted a little bit at the end of chapter 1, that there were people in James's church that were impressed with the religion that James was not as impressed about. And if you kind of read between the lines, you kind of think that they might have been pious. You kind of see a little bit of the Pharisees in them. And they're maybe a little bit high on their own acts of obedience, but James says true religion is to visit widows and orphans in their distress. And you get the feeling that these particular Christians had written that out of their view of religion, that they had other marks. You know, they had their holiness markings, that you know you're holy because you do this and you do this and you don't do this and this. And James doesn't really address that directly, but he says, but if you don't visit widows and orphans, you're not religious. You've missed it. And so you kind of see he's already addressed this. Now he hits it harder. Now he hits it harder that if you show partiality and you show that you have a wrong view of riches and poverty by not showing concern for the poor, you've broken God's law. So he's talking about partiality as sin. A violation of a law that he's already mentioned is the law of love. That partiality is a violation of our responsibility to love. Really, you see that in Leviticus chapter 19 that has the verse, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In the context of Leviticus 19, he's talking about not showing partiality towards the rich or towards the poor, either one. But he's talking about love that overcomes that desire to kind of get personal reward, to show favoritism because of someone's own interest. And love is the antidote to that kind of partiality. So here, the people in James's church, they are breaking God's law of love and therefore are breaking the king's law. And then he goes on to say, this is a serious matter. That breaking one of the laws is breaking the law. So breaking part of the law breaks all of the law. The law stands together as a unit. It stands together as an integrity. And that point that he presses here is that you might think, well, maybe there's a minor part, or maybe there's a part that I'll just break this, but basically I'm keeping God's commandments. James wants to cut through that argument and say that if you are partial, you are breaking all of the law. So it's not so easily put off. The Pharisees were notable, not quite as much as the Sadducees, but the Pharisees were notable for their favoring of the wealthy and a despising of the poor, partly because they had a theology that said if you were poor, you deserved it. If you're crippled, you probably sinned, or your parents sinned, or somebody sinned, and you deserved it. In fact, they even seem to be a little upset with Jesus for reversing these things because they kind of see it as it was God's will for this person to be a leper. It was God's will for this person to be blind. Who are you to reverse these things? So doctors were not always favored by the Pharisees as kind of violating this natural law or something. And you kind of get this sense that Jesus is kind of breaking through that hardness of heart and that wrong theology. And James is doing the same thing. We overrate riches and poverty from a physical point of view and ought to be looking, as we saw last week, to see what God really prizes. What does God value? What does God see as really worthwhile? What kind of attributes does God prize? So I think the implication here of this section is that James is saying, if you obey all these strict things in all these ways, but you disobey one, you've nullified the rest. That you're a lawbreaker. That, even a pirate does a lot of good things, probably. But if he steals stuff that doesn't belong to him, he's a pirate and is judged as a breaker of the law. So one that disregards one's obligation to be kind to the poor, to have a disinterested favor, or maybe, as I pointed out Sunday morning, about an interested favor towards the poor, that you actually enjoy showing favor towards them, that is a mark of true commitment to God. And to disregard that is to nullify the strictness of obedience. In this, he draws attention to the person behind the law. Notice what he says about the law. It's been given by someone. In verse number 11, for he who said, do not commit adultery, he also said, do not murder. In other words, he's pressing behind the law to the lawgiver. So you got individual laws, however many there are, 10 commandments, and then other laws that are under those or related to those. But behind the 10 is one lawgiver. And so to break the law is not only to break an individual law, it's to reject the lawgiver. It's to go against the lawgiver. It's an insurrection against the king. And this particular king is the king of the universe. This king is the king of the cosmos. And so to show favoritism is to overthrow the cosmic king. It's to seek to have insurrection against the king. So again, I've been stressing in James 2 that James isn't just concerned about partiality as a breaking of law. It's a breaking of God, of God's will, of God's favor. It's an overthrowing of God. His name is defiled. His favor is ignored. And so there's a kind of a great seriousness, insurrection being the most serious of a national crime that is overthrowing the government itself. And so trying to show favoritism is seeking to overthrow the one who makes all laws, God himself. Just a question that I have when I read this. James says that if you, the one who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. And then he says, if you don't commit adultery, but you do murder, you've broken the law. And just a guess here, why does he pick adultery and murder? Maybe he just picks two serious ones, and one is just as equal as the other, and that's a valid point. Hard to argue against it. But when we read the book of James as a whole, you can't help but be tempted to think that murder doesn't just show up here accidentally. That you wonder that showing partiality is edging on murder. It's a carelessness about people's lives. And at times, I think that was probably literally true. If you neglect the poor, you might neglect their life. And that famous image that Charles Dickens put out with his A Christmas Carol, with Ebenezer Scrooge being heartless towards his employee Bob Cratchit, and heartless towards his family, and he had the weakest member of his family, poor Tiny Tim, is on the verge of death. And so Ebenezer Scrooge's miserliness and his contempt for giving bordered on the extermination of Tiny Tim. And Dickens is kind of relating here a biblical and a Christian theme, is that carelessness about the poor is a very dangerous kind of thing. It could be taking of someone's life. So, James doesn't necessarily come out and say, what you're doing is murder, but you can't help by thinking this particular analogy he gives. Okay, you're very concerned about adultery. Okay, good. But are you concerned about people's lives as much as you are about that? Are you as interested in that? God is concerned about all those things. So don't be foolish and keep one part of the law and then be careless about someone's very life. And finally, he talks about the mercy, about the place of mercy, and the place of mercy from a Christian salvation point of view. Again, James, as we keep hinting at, James is a book that is very much interested in how faith is worked out, what faith does in practice. James is a good theologian, but he's especially a good theologian about Christianity making an impact in life. And he's very suspicious of people that say something and do nothing. And he's just very suspicious about people that make a claim of salvation, but it hasn't impacted their life. And this is the key area. This idea of showing mercy and not showing partiality is one of the key issues that he thinks that Christianity should make a difference in our lives. So in verse number 12, so speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty, for judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Now, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to have to delve into this idea of the relationship between faith and works and salvation apart from what we do, and salvation as that which has an evidence that shows up in our life. And this is attached to that section. So we can't go into detail about faith versus works, but we can see what the text is saying. And we ought to take into heart what the text is putting before us. And that is, he says, there is an expectation of God that we will be measured by. And love, is what he's been talking about, is a major part of that standard. You will be judged by the law of liberty. So you'll be judged by the love that you show. You'll be judged by the love that you don't show. And there's no avoiding that. It's God's standard. It's what he's looking for in his people. You can't help but be impressed as we're talking about faith and works, and will be in the next couple of weeks, talking about faith and works, that there's two evidences of Christianity in the Gospels. One is faith in Christ, that's well known. But the second is love for his people. And those two things are constantly put together, that there's a great number of people that claim faith but show no love for God's people. And John, in his epistle, 1 John, is very concerned about that. And James is too, is very concerned about the prospect of someone claiming Christ but not caring that the standard or the expectation of God is love. He does call it the law of liberty. And this would be a tempting point to speak about some of the powers and the virtues of love. And one of the great things about love is that it's a command, but it's a command that is a command rooted in willingness or personal disposition to do it. So it's the best kind of command. The command of, that's maybe against your will, you might do it, kind of grimace or grin and bear it. But love, you can't just grin and bear. In order to love, you have to want to do it. You have to put yourself into it. And that's the most powerful kind of obedience. The obedience that's against your will, has a lot of limitations to it. But the obedience rooted in a disposition of willingness, of favor, of wanting to do it, has no limits. It's a freedom that also is lawful. And that's the great power of the Christian ethic, that love is the greatest of the virtues, the greatest of the Christian ethical commands. Even better than self-sacrifice. As noble as self-sacrifice is, love is better than self-sacrifice. Because love takes one another's good as their own. So James is urging us to really get into this and see it see it our liberty, to see it our privilege to help the the poor, the needy, the down and out, the neglected, and do it out of a sense of willingness to do it because we have a favor towards those. So he now talks about this issue of judgment and mercy, and reflecting upon some of the commands or some of the teaching of Jesus that links the judgment of God with the judgmental person. And one of the repeated illustrations and teaching of Jesus are people that are judgmental, that are judged by others. For example, Jesus gives an extended parable about a man we might call the unmerciful servant, who owed a tremendous debt. In fact, it's an absurd. It's 10,000 talents, which is impossible. No one can owe 10,000 talents. Although we are stretching it with $30 trillion national debt, that's probably more than 10,000 talents, but barely more. Anyway, this guy that owes 10,000 talents, his master forgives it. Which, who can afford to forgive so much? But the illustration is God forgives so much. But then the man who owed 10,000 talents, who is forgiven, goes and finds someone that owed him a few months to a year's wages, and the man can't pay, so he throws him into prison. And so the king, or the first landowner, or the first king, whatever, hears about it, gets angry, and he gets angry at this unmerciful servant and casts him into outer darkness. And Jesus is clearly illustrating the expectation of a Christian is that they have been loved, they've been loved by God, therefore they should love. So you can't help but think when you read James' writing here about judgment to those that judge and mercy to those that are merciful, reflected in Jesus' own teaching about what we should expect. So theologically, if we we want to be theologically correct, God loves us first. God forgives us first. And that in turn impacts us to be merciful to others. And that's an important theological way to say it. But we also need to think of the more direct way that he says it. If we have been judgmental, if we are so prejudiced towards people that we show favoritism, and we don't show love, the king is expected to find love in us. And if he doesn't find in us, we can expect judgment. The Apostle John writes the same thing in 1 John, where he's talking about love being perfected. And what he means is that love being shown or demonstrated to others. So James says, if you've been born again, you will be a loving person. And that should be reflected in how you treat people. And then he says that perfect love casts out fear. And he's not talking here about somehow you get to a perfect state of feeling love. That's not what he means. What he means is that if you actually love other people, then you don't need to fear judgment because you've shown that the love of God abides in you. And if the love of God abides in you, that means you've been born again by the Spirit of God who is of love. So James' point is the same as John in saying that you should expect to be a loving person towards others if God has entered your life through Jesus Christ. And if you can go on showing favoritism against the poor and towards the rich, then you might expect God's judgment to have such a harsh judgment against what God has favored and what God has commanded. Well, those are challenging teachings. They are compelling teachings, and they're Christian teachings. And where the church has done its best, it's done this well. It's shown compassion to the poor, and we can say with some kind of Christian pride that there's been a lot of places that the gospel has gone that this has gone with it. Christians going into poor areas and feeding the poor and bringing sanitation, beginning education of the young, of teaching language so that they could improve their lives. And if you just think about world history, some of the great organizations rooted in Christian compassion, Salvation Army, Red Cross, hospitals, how many hospitals have Christian names to them, how many universities founded in the name of Christ, how many undergraduate schools or elementary schools, how many daycare centers are rooted in Christian compassion. And it's one of the best testimonies of Christ to the world, is the compassion shown towards the least of these among God's children. So let us be compassionate, that we need not fear God's judgment, but know His mercy is shown towards those who have lived out His mercy towards others. Well, thanks for joining us on our live stream. I encourage you to change over on the medium to our Zoom meeting, that we might interact with each other and take some prayer requests and go to prayer. Thanks a lot for joining us this evening. Have a good night.